Thank you, Sam, and thank you everybody at Tyndale for your welcome today. My name is Sarah and I'm one of the organising committee for the Lent Conversations on behalf of Churches Together in Cottam, Clifton, Redland with Hotwells. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight, and I know that we've got people watching on Zoom as well. Bit difficult for people on Zoom, you won't see, but could you put your hand up if you've been to one of our talks in this series already? We've had 2. Wonderful. So that's the majority of people. So great. We've got repeat business, Dave. So that's wonderful. Really, really great. As you know, this whole series of Lent Conversations is taking its theme of the environment, climate change and faith. And we've had a wonderful variety of speakers. We can only really make this happen because of your donations. Here we go. Here's the push now. My colleague Pearl will be at the back. There she is. She's holding up our beautiful donations basket on the way out. So please do donate. We obviously want to be able to give something to obviously pay expenses, but to give something to our speakers and the charities or concerns that they are representing. You know what's going to happen tonight. In fact, you probably know what's going to happen tonight better than our speaker does, because you've been with us already for two of our evenings. We will hear from the Reverend Dr. Dave Gregory for about half an hour or so, Dave? Yeah, okay. And then we'll give you a couple of minutes to just chat with your neighbour about, what came out of it for you. And then this microphone will be roving around for you to ask your questions of Dave afterwards. So I hope that's clear. Now, the man himself. I feel a bit strange doing this because he's known me for 150 years, actually. So, so Dave has been a Baptist minister for over 20 years. And he's a science faith communicator with a master's in applied theology from Oxford University, which focused on that interface between faith and science. This is the science bit, like the L'Oreal advert. He has degrees in physics and astrophysics from Leicester University, and a doctorate in atmospheric physics from Imperial College London. And Dave undertook research at the Met Office when it was in Bracknell. That's when we knew each other, wasn't it? You were a meteorology researcher then. And the Hadley Centre and the European Weather Centre. And Dave focused on weather forecasting and climate for 50 years. And then, did I say 50? 15. I'm really sorry. Well, these... Dave, you followed that up by your work in as a Baptist minister, and in 2018 to 2019, Dave was president of the Baptist Union, which led him to come to these parts and many others as he travelled around going to Baptist churches with a theme which possibly echoes what you're going to hear today. Now, Dave's field as a scientist and his work in the ministry come together now as he's recently stepped away from being a local church minister to serve as Baptist missioner for science and the environment. So he's here for you, anybody who goes to Tyndale and other churches, Baptist churches in Bristol. Dave also has another persona. He does. He's Dr. Dave. And he coordinates the Messy Church Does Science project, which uses science experiments to help families explore the wonder of creation and the wonder of the Creator. And it's now used in messy churches in several countries. And in fact, David was telling me earlier that he's off to Australasia to do some training later this year. So it's being used globally, which is absolutely amazing. He also led the development of the follow-on project, which is Mess AI Church, exploring robots, AI, and faith, and is science advisor for Messy Church Goes Wild Adventures. And he's also a regular speaker with God and the Big Bang, exploring science and faith issues with primary and secondary school students. And he comes to us from Pershore Abbey today, where he's been with school children exploring these themes. So, everybody, he's not an avatar, he's not virtual reality, he's not deep fake, he is the Reverend Dr. Dave Gregory. And tonight he's going to talk to us and show us some films as well. Now My Eyes Have Seen You, Seeing God in Creation. Over to you, Dave.
Well, good evening, everybody, and it's great to be with you. I hate sitting there listening to things like that. That was so a generous introduction. My name's Dave Gregory. I'm this thing called a Baptist Missioner for Science and Environment. Do you want to know what a Baptist Missioner for Science and Environment does? I don't know. I'm making it up as I go along, really, because I don't think there's ever been a Baptist Missioner for Science and Environment before. But I was involved in local church until about 18 months ago, when I kind of stepped back because I'd increasingly got involved in engagement between science and faith. Now, I have been with today in Pershore Abbey 120 Year 6 students from local churches, from Anglican schools and a Catholic school, with a team from God and the Big Bang, exploring different aspects of science, the Big Bang, what's in a can. That's about curiosity, finding out what's in a tin can without a label, climate change and evolution. Now, at the end, we all say we've done a good job at the end of the day if they ask us brilliant questions. I challenge you. Come up with some better questions than they did today, because they were fantastic. They're always fantastic. I was sitting there thinking, this talk has a Bristol link to it in its origin. This work I've been doing about trying to engage people with issues around the environment through visual media. Because I was at a ministers' conference in my region, the Central Baptist Association, and our speaker was Chris Ellis. Now, Chris, I think, was the principal of Bristol Baptist College. In fact, his brother Rob was the minister of this church. And Rob was my lead tutor when I trained at Oxford for 3 years. He arrived at the same time as me. He confessed at the end of 3 years that when he first met us, he wondered what he was going to do with us in terms of training. But he didn't do a bad job. We all ended up doing quite well in ministry. But Chris came to talk to the ministers about icons, a very Baptist thing to talk about. But he had an interest in art, and he was talking about icons and Greek icons and the spirituality around that. And it was really interesting and helpful. But at the end of one of his talks, I put up my hand, because I'm one of these people who always thinks of questions. I put up my hand and said, is there any way nature could be an icon to enable us to encounter God? Now, not putting Chris down, but he said, oh, well, no, not really, because icons are very specific works of art. They're painted in a very specific way. But to be honest, I thought that was not a good answer. So this is about 8 years ago. So I've been gradually exploring this idea of how do we encounter God through the world around us. And, is there any way we can use that to alert people to the issues around the environmental crisis and climate change? So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Now, you've had one introduction to me, but I just briefly want to show you another introduction to me, because one of the projects I've been working on in the last year with actually a film company based in Bristol, the Fuelcast, who it's run by a pioneer Baptist minister who's a filmmaker, is this project called God Saw That It Was Good. So we've been making films around environmental themes which weave together imagery, science around the environment and faith together. And I thought we'd kick off by showing you the first 4 minutes of the film based on trees, filmed, of all places, in that well-known forest of Milton Keynes. You laugh, but wait. That should work, but it's not. This appears to have frozen. So let's go back. Here we go.
I was walking with a friend along the northern edge of Milton Keynes, the city in which I live. It's a new city, just over 50 years old, entering its middle age in human terms. Known for its many roundabouts and famous concrete cows. But as we walked up a small rise, we turned and looked back. 250,000 people live within the city, but little of their presence can be seen. Only a few of the taller buildings give a hint of the human city with its sprawling suburban estates amongst a grid of fast-flowing traffic. The rest is hidden amongst a city of trees. 1 million of them planted since the human city started to be raised up. Now, we think of the Earth as a human planet, and yet this look back reminds us that it's truly a planet of the trees. There are 8 billion people alive on the Earth today, living among 300 trillion trees, 400 for every person on Earth. Living creatures that we too often take for granted, useful for our buildings, our homes and our fences, and providing fuel for heating and cooking, or that bit of greenery and shade in our urban environments. Yet unaware, we are beholden to them for the part that they play in sustaining the Earth as a place where life may flourish. A truly global community connected to the material of the Earth, the water, the soil, the air, even to one another, in ways that science is slowly revealing. My name's Gregory. I'm a church minister with a background in and passion for God's gift of science. And in this series, we want to reawaken you to the wondrous world that surrounds us. Wonder that science reveals in ways that perhaps no generation before has seen. A richly diverse world, connected together, each playing its part. We want to help you look in a fresh way at this world which is a gift to us, giving us life, and in which our life is woven perhaps more than we know, even entwined with the playfulness and the being of God. So come and join the journey, looking at our world and perhaps beyond it.
Another one of the motivations behind trying to use films to engage people with the environment and a spiritual side to it is a recognition. A recognition that people are, entranced by these stunning visual pictures that are broadcast constantly through our media. So hands up if you have never seen a David Attenborough documentary over the last 30 years. Okay, so we all know these amazing films that he has been making. And he's done a great job, actually, in the last decade or so of raising the issue of climate change amongst the general public and society globally. And so I began to wonder, could you use this kind of imagery to engage people in a different way? Now, these kind of documentaries have a long heritage. In fact, if you want to discover one of the earliest nature documentaries, you need to look in the Bible, at the end of the book of Job. Because here is Job, a very troubled man for all kind of valid reasons, and he has lots of questions and complaints. So what does God do at the end of it all? He shows him a nature documentary. He takes him on a tour of the wonder of the natural world, the earth, the animals, the sky. And at the end of it, Job says this: I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen you. We spend a lot of time in our churches, in our faith communities, hearing about God. But here is a powerful experience which kind of takes Job out of that mode of complaint to say, I've actually seen something of God in this rich variety and wonder of the natural world. So is there a way we can use this kind of encounter with the visual way of looking at the world that enables us to reawaken people's sense of spirituality and a connection with the divine through it? During COVID, I was on sabbatical. I delayed my sabbatical from 2020 to 2021. I went on sabbatical on a Monday morning, and I think we locked down on Tuesday. So I had a stay-batical, which involved me walking through our local woods and reading. And one of the books I read was a fascinating book by Timothy Radcliffe. I think he was the former head of the Dominican order. It's called Alive in God. It was a really refreshing book. But he said this right at the beginning, talking about the kind of secularization there is in our culture and society. How can we re-engage the imagination of our contemporaries? Well, I think our contemporaries in our society's imagination's engaged by David Attenborough nature documentaries. So is the way we can engage them in seeing something of God's action in the world, and actually not just them, but ourselves as well. Because one of the things I discovered walking through the woods and the countryside around Croxley Green on the edge of London, just inside the M25, is actually God was there on those walks I took through the woods, through the countryside in that area. God kind of turned up and showed himself to me in lots and lots of visual ways. There have been lots of things that have fed into my stimulation here. I love old history. I love ancient history. And so me and my wife, a good night out for us is going into London to the British Museum and looking through the exhibit there. And a few years ago, before COVID, they had a really fascinating exhibition called Living with the Gods. It was an exploration of spirituality through the relics that people had left through history. And two objects caught my eye. Let's... I just mentioned this. Sorry, I'm out of sequence a bit. I still take an interest in climate science, even though I've been out of the field academically in research for 20 years. And so when the last United Nations report was released in 2021, I sat in on the press conference in August. And this is a quote from one of the UN administrators about the report, speaking to the scientists. And she said, "You scientists have been speaking for 30 years about climate change." And that's true. Since the 1990s, scientists have been raising the issue of climate change with society globally since the first IPCC reports then. And then she said, "But we've not been listening." And I didn't know at that point whether to laugh or cry. To cry because nobody had been listening for 30 years while a lot of us have been trying to raise this issue, or to laugh because finally someone was listening. But then it got me thinking, I think, as scientists, we made a mistake. Scientists like facts and figures and information. I think we thought if we gave people enough facts and figures and information, they would listen. That's not how it works. People do not respond to that kind of information. It's more about the heart. It's more about their emotions, their feelings. That motivates them. And The same year, later that year, in New Scientist magazine, which is not known for its positive views of God and faith, by the way, invited a climate scientist in the state called Catherine Hayhoe, who's a big climate campaigner, Christian, to write an article about how you engage people with climate change. And this is what she wrote: the most powerful conversations being with our hearts, not with our heads. And so maybe when we're trying to engage people with this, we need to think about how they respond with their hearts, their emotions, their feelings, not just how they respond to the facts that we're given. And I think by engaging them with the visual, that's what we can try and do. So living with the gods, there were two pieces of the exhibit, one at the end and one at the beginning, which I think spoke to me about how we might engage with people. The one at the end was a poster from the Soviet Union celebrating the first person in space, Yuri Gagarin. And my Russian is not good, but I think the translation is this, is no God. No God. And there's a story behind this. There are two possibilities here. One possibility is that when he was doing his single orbit of the world in 1961, they radioed up from the ground and said, "Hey, Yuri, can you see God up there?" And he said, "No, there isn't a God." Now, that is highly unlikely because he nearly died on that mission, and he was having to work hard even to get down to Earth after one orbit. The other way this story is told is at a meal at the Kremlin. During the meal, Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, turned to Yuri and said, "Hey, Yuri, when you were up there, did you see God?" And he said, "No, that's more likely." And so they made a big poster out of this, a propaganda poster. You look up there, "No, I didn't see God." The other image was at the start of the exhibition, and it's this image here, a Hindu image of the Lord of the Dance, the god of creation and destruction. And you will find this statue in the grounds of CERN, which is the Particle Accelerator Institute on the border of Switzerland and France. And it's a gift from the Indian government to celebrate the collaboration of Indian scientists with the scientists at CERN. And underneath it, it says, when you look at the smallest parts of our creation, you see a continual creation and destruction of matter. These are two ways of actually looking at the scientific view which dominates our thinking in our world. One's very technical. One's very imaginative, seeing it as full of metaphor and meaning. And Pope Francis, when he wrote his encyclical on the environment, talked about two ways of looking at the world. One is a technocratic way of looking at the world, which focuses on the materialness of the world, the mechanism of the world, the concepts. It's a very rational way of looking at the world. Theologically, this is linked to a theological movement that evolved in the later Middle Ages called nominalism. And Charles Taylor, who's done a lot of work about how we look at the world and how science evolved, actually from Christian theology, said actually this theological strand, which then fed into science, this is what disenchanted our vision of the world. This is about the scientific way of looking at the world. But Pope Francis talked about another way of looking at the world, a more sacramental way of looking at the world, which is about encountering the transcendent, looking for meaning, using metaphor, using the imagination to explore the world that we see around us. This is linked to an earlier theological movement, earlier on in the Middle Ages, a more what's called exemplarism. It was about looking for signs and symbols, seeing creation as a window, an icon into the activity, the being, the presence of God. This is a more sacramental way of looking at the world. It's more artistic, sacramental. And the way often we look at nature and creation is through this lens of a very technocratic way that we've been trained to look at through science, which has become a dominant narrative in our culture in the West and actually around the world to a large extent. And maybe we need a shift to this more sacramental way of looking at the world. See, if you read the Bible, it's an incredibly visual and imaginative book. At the start of the creation story in the Bible, it said, God said, let there be light. But actually, at the end of it, he didn't look at the world and say it was good. It actually said he looked back at what he had made and he saw that it was good. It was visual. And in those early stories of how God created the world, when you get to the story of the Garden of Eden, it talks about God planting a garden. It was more like a forest because it mentions the trees which were good for food, but actually were pleasing to the eye, beautiful to see. And then he takes all the animals and brings them to Adam, and Adam names them. That involves looking. I heard a story of a friend of ours has just had her first grandson's been born. And for the first week we said, has the baby got a name yet? Oh, no. No, they're following this new thing that parents do these days. They live with the baby for a week. They observe it. They watch it. They see what it's like. And then they name it after actually they've lived with it and seen it for a week. A name that reflects what they're seeing. It's what Adam was doing. Naming the creatures around them by looking at them. So even in the start of the Bible, when we get those stories of creation, it's an incredibly visual experience and language that is used. And the Bible is an incredibly visual book and a visual story. Now, it's contentious because, it says in the Bible, you shan't make an image for yourself to worship. This is actually an image of Baal from the temple in Baalbek in northern Lebanon, which I visited when I was BU president, when I was over there for a week or so. And so there's been a resistance in Christian history and faith to actually using the visual to encounter God. Baptists are really good at this. Our churches tend to be very plain, although I notice here there are stained glass windows. So I'm not complaining. I was baptized in a Baptist church in London with stained glass windows as well. But most Baptist churches do not have stained glass windows. We just have plain. We're terrible at this. But the Bible is an incredibly visual book, and often the visualization involves creation. So God sets his rainbow in the clouds as a sign of his care for the whole of creation. And then, Job, that I've talked about that visual experience that Job had. Who has the wisdom to count the number or to number the clouds? That involves looking. A part of my research doing my PhD on thunderstorms, I did count clouds at one point. So the Bible's incredibly visual. And then you step over into the New Testament and you find it continues. This visual engagement with faith. So in John's first letter, talking about his experience of Jesus. Jesus which we have heard and seen and looked at and touched. Visual again, twice. And actually in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, with their use of icons, with Jesus coming to be seen amongst us, as well as heard and touched, they would say actually the priority of encountering God has shifted from hearing to seeing because of the incarnation of Jesus. And even Jesus himself, when he taught, he was incredibly visual in his stories. And often that visualization was, look at creation around you. Look at the lilies of the field. Look at the birds of the air. Look at the mustard seed, which becomes the biggest tree. It's all rich visual encounters with creation. And maybe we've lost that in our gathering in buildings. Maybe it's something we started to rediscover in COVID, and while we're trying to let COVID fade into our distant memory because of the trauma of it all, actually the one thing we need to hang on to is a sense of connection with creation again. Maybe here is a way we can engage with God and engage with the environmental crisis that the world is facing. But if we're going to do that, we have to begin to look at the world differently through a different lens, moving away from this kind of technical way of looking at the world to this more imaginative way of looking at the world. So we need to move away from this technocratic to this more sacramental way of looking at the world. But if we're going to do that, we have to retrain our vision. We have to retrain our vision. And we need to take a more kind of artistic way of looking at the world rather than a scientific way of looking at the world. So, how do we see when it comes to art? This is a very famous painting called The Scream by Edvard Munch. Do you know this painting? I actually got to see it in the British Museum again in an exhibition on Edvard Munch. Now, what is Munch trying to express in this painting? You see, art is a bit slippery, isn't it? It's a bit fluid because the artist may have an experience or have an idea and paint some meaning into his painting. But then when other people come to view it, perhaps generations later on, they can get something totally different out of it. They can interpret it in a totally different way because of their experience of life and their culture. So here is what an arts page on the BBC website says about Edvard Munch's painting. This expresses humanity cut loose from all the certainties. There is no God, tradition, no habits or customs, an existential crisis facing a universe he doesn't understand and can only relate to in a feeling of panic. Cool, that makes you feel good, doesn't it? Why on earth would you want to go and see this painting if that's what it means? Interestingly, when they showed it in the British Museum, they had an extract from Munch's journal that he wrote about why he painted this. And this is what he wrote. He was standing before a blood-red sky, and he stood there trembling with anxiety. So there's anxiety in that, in his experience. There's anxiety in the interpretation of it. And I sense an infinite scream pass through nature. It's not about the scream in himself. It's about the scream he perceives in the world around him. Maybe he's projecting his own anxiety onto the world, but there is something here that he experienced and saw that motivated him to paint this painting, which actually the reviewer 100 years later is missing. See, there's a fluidity in how we interpret art. And actually that's a fluidity that's not always there in science. So there is this creativity, imagination, and use of metaphor in art. You could say it's like water slipping through your fingers. The artist may have one meaning, but it can slip away quickly and you can interpret it in a totally different way, and that's fine. That's part of the joy of art that I'm slowly learning as a reforming scientist, having not studied art at all until recently. What about science then? How do we see in science? This is a blood-red sky. Took it last year in Italy. Went up to the high mountains in the flower meadows with a picnic with my family, my wife, my 2 daughters, and we sat there watching the sunset. Fantastic experience. And I took this picture, blood-red sky. You know, if you want to understand what is going on in that picture scientifically, it's red because the air molecules and the dust in the air is scattering the red wider, so that's what you see. You know, you can explain this image in terms of scientific terms, and then when you come back to it later on, the science is rather fixed. So when we're kind of exploring a process in science, there is a lot of creativity and imagination in exploring how the world works, in doing experiments, in thinking up explanations. It's equally as creative as an artist would be. But then later on, when you come to explain what is going on, actually it tends to become rather solid. Once you've kind of explained something of why it is in the world, then that's just taken as solid fact when you teach it and explore it later on. So if we're going to retrain ourselves, then we need to kind of unfreeze the image to allow maybe an exploration of the world that science kind of brings to us in terms of metaphor and imagination. So we need to almost unfreeze this way of looking at the world so that we can kind of capture something that Francis Hayes, who's a Franciscan who studied an earlier Franciscan called Bonaventura, to kind of see the entire universe, the cosmos, as a vast symbol of God, a work of art that expresses a divine idea in something that isn't divine. And if we're going to do that through this visual encounter with the world and through the science that we often hear explained through these stunning nature documentaries, we need to kind of look at the science in a slightly different way, in a softer way, in an imaginative way, that maybe will allow God to speak to us again. So we need a new lens. I'm interested in a theologian called Peter Berger. Actually, he wasn't so much a theologian, he was a Christian sociologist. But he was really interested in how do you help people see God in a culture where they don't think about God, or see God as rather distant, or not there at all. And he suggested there are certain things in human experience which might be able to point them back to the presence of God in the world. And the experiences are wonder, playfulness, and a sense of order. It is not just religious people who experience a sense of awe and wonder when they look at the world. It's almost a universal experience. Looking at a magnificent sunset from the top of an Italian mountain as it sinks and sets is a moment of wonder. Looking at a new human baby for the first time, there's a sense of wonder there. This is something everyone experiences. And maybe here is a moment when we are encountering God. And then playfulness. We like to play. We like to explore, we like to play games, but we like to play with ideas and imagination. And maybe here is a moment of creativity which reflects something of the creativity of God that we see within creation. And we like order. We like things to be structured, we feel comfortable with that. And maybe here again is a moment when we're encountering the God who brings order to the world. Because when God made the world, it was a bit of a mess. Have you read that story at the start? It's a bit of a mess, isn't it? It's a raging ocean covered in darkness with a storm whipping up a maelstrom on it. And then God gradually brings it to order. So maybe in this sense of order, we're encountering something of the activity of God in the world. What interests me is these themes of wonder, playfulness, and order actually are things that often drive science. You know, tomorrow night I'm going to meet with my dining club. It's not that posh. It's called the Meteorological Dining Club, you see. And when I was working at the Met Office, one heard rumours of this select club, which was by invitation only, and they never invited me. But I met some of my old colleagues at a funeral about 5 years ago. I have a friend of mine at the Met Office who sadly died very young. And they invited me to the Met Dining Club. I mean, I hadn't been an active meteorologist for 15 years, but somehow they thought I might quite like to go. And so I went, and they invited me to their Christmas meal. And they invited me as a guest. If you go as a guest, you don't pay, but you have to give a short speech after the dinner as a thought starter. So you have to pay for your supper. So I talked about wonder in science and faith. And I spoke for about 5 minutes. And then it's open for discussion. Only one person who spoke said, well, everyone bar one said wonder was one of their motivations for wanting to do scientific research. That the wonder they saw of the world, that was why they wanted to know more. Wonder is part of science. It's part of our everyday experience as well. And then I'd say playfulness. Science is incredibly creative and playful, coming up with ideas and experiments. Very creative. And then seeking order. That's what science tries to do. It tries to take these little bits of information you get by looking out at the world. It tries to bring them together into an ordered pattern to understand how the world works. And actually, Bonaventura, who I spoke to earlier on, when he was an early Franciscan, and he said, you know what? When you look at the world, you can see God through your experience of wonder, through the absolute sheer playfulness that there is in creation, which reflects something of God's desire and imagination. And you can see something of God drawing everything together back to himself into some kind of divine order and communion. So the same things that we have in our science, he was seeing in creation as signs of God. So what interests me is, how can you take this experience that we have of creation now, which is quite scientific, and bring that into play with this faith way of looking at the world through these three themes of wonder, playfulness, and communion? So, wonder. The theologian Planenberg says wonder is a response to the eternal act of God, who doesn't just create in the beginning, but he's continually creating in the world. I love that what I've talked about earlier about, at the end of the creation stories, God takes a step back and it says, he saw it was very good. If I'm talking to children about that, I will say this is a moment when God steps back and goes, wow, this is good. This is very good. It's like our experience of wonder. This is God's moment of wonder over what he has made. And God is incredibly playful. God plays in creation, in the diversity of it. And actually in our creativity, it's a pale reflection of God's creativity. And the creativity we see in the world is a pale reflection of God's creativity. And then, God tries to bring everything into an order which is centered upon himself, a relationship with himself. So in these three kind of themes is the possibility of seeing something of God within the world. So we made these films, 4 films. God saw that it was good. One on coasts, one on the sky, because I'm a weatherman and I like looking at the sky. One on trees, one on life. They're on this website here. They're about 25 minutes long each. The first part explores creation through these themes of wonder, playfulness, and order, weaving in our experience of creation with the science what science has revealed about the world around us, and that ends with a more kind of prayerful reflection on it. And we're just going to end by playing you the final reflection from the trees video that you saw the start of. Again, filmed in Milton Keynes, this forest with which the city exists. So watch this, and maybe you might sense God's presence amongst creation. And maybe if we do that, then we might be changed in our attitude and the way we live, and we might value it more for what it is, but as a place to encounter God.
The creation story of the Bible begins with a city of trees, Eden, a garden where God causes trees of all kinds to grow. And it ends with a city, the New Jerusalem, which is full of trees, the tree of life, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. Between the two, the human story is woven. Bookends that speak of the long history of trees upon the earth, of our relationship with them, of their role in sustaining the earth to be a place able to bear life. The trees of Eden are described as being of all kinds, beautiful to behold, pleasing to the eye, perhaps wondrous too. As we walk through woods and forests, are we drawn to look up? Stretching our arms upward, we reach up maybe a few meters, and yet around us, the twig tips of the long bodies of beech and oak comfortably stretch 30, 40 meters above the earth. Majestic but small compared to the true Gothic cathedral of trees, sequoia, reaching up 3 times as tall. Pleasing to see, yet humbling, even a little fearful. Growing over centuries, even millennia of uninterrupted sun-directed praise. Trees which, with the whole of creation, sing for joy before the Lord. An ancient song, rolling around the earth day after day after day. Greater than the joy of a stadium conference or the most vibrant worship that we can offer. Maybe it makes you feel a bit small, quite temporary, bringing awareness of our fragility and dependency upon others in the community of creation and with God. Leading us to humility fostered beyond their majestic grandeur by God's gift of science that tells us of their skills as engineers, mathematicians, soil, water and atmospheric chemists, green energy suppliers for themselves as well as the whole forest community. What might the trees be telling us about our use of science in shaping our cities and worlds? Jesus told a story about the trees, of planting a mustard seed, the smallest of seed that grows to become a tree that all the birds of the air make their nests in its branches. And this is how God is at work, he says. The city of trees, in their playful mixture of shape and size, form and colour, long easily seen with our eyes, along with their secrets that science now reveals to us, are host to an equally playful community of life. As you walk below the foundations of this high-rise living, do you look up, watching out for the squirrels scampering up and down the vertical highways of the trees, or the forest aviators as they expertly navigate the air within the branchy canopy? If you have time, you might try and count how many different types of ants and beetles, spiders and snails can be found going about their daily business on each high-rise trunk. You could stay for a long time. If you're a fancier of fungi, liching and moss, that's more time still. And to complete the count, in the cloud forests of more tropical climes, you'd have to climb to the treetops. And there you'd find another forest above your heads as the ephonites, the aptly named air plants, and the ferns colonize the canopy far, far above the forest floor. Perhaps the trees have something to teach us here. They, like us, are creatures that seek the strength of community, nurturing their young, sharing resources with their own kinds and others. The strength of a tree is neither in its rootstock or its woody trunk. It's in the forest. A forest quietly nudges its own environment, making life better for its community, bit by bit. You see, trees are in it for the long term. It can take several hundred years for a forest to mature, the trees along with the soil on which they depend. We too desire to create our environment, yet our shaping of the world is more impatient than that of the trees, and perhaps not as generous. Through long ages, we've cleared the forest with stone axe or power tools, making space for farms, turning vibrant, diverse ecosystems into single-species communities. Pasture for cattle or palm tree plantations to supply the needs of our modern living. Like ripping down a playful variety of houses in a picturesque village built across the generations and replacing it with a suburban sprawl of identical homes. More convenient for living, perhaps, but you'll never find those images gracing a greetings card or a calendar. As the city of trees is replaced by our human cities, the balance that has kept the climate stable through human history is disturbed. We're slow to learn the lessons of the trees, of the vast reserves of natural energy that might power our lives, technology that our science and technical ingenuity can mimic drawing energy from the sun. Yet we choose to continue to burn coal and the remains of long-buried trees together with those we chop down today, adding warming carbon dioxide to the air and reducing the ability of the Earth to moderate the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. As forests are replaced by pasture, the ability of the land to absorb carbon is reduced. The warming, shifting climate disturbs the environment in which the trees have adapted through long ages. Only able to move slowly, as fast as the wind or animals and insects can spread their seeds, perhaps less than a kilometre a year. With their long journey to adulthood, it leaves them weaker, prone to disease and new pests, more susceptible to the growing extremes of weather in a warmer climate. The Bible story begins and ends with a tree, the tree of life, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. In our age of climate change and environmental loss, what might we learn from the trees that have sustained the life of the earth through long, long ages? How might we live with God to bring healing to the nations of the world, nations of people, nations of trees, and others in the wondrous, playful creation with which we are entwined and for whom God cares?
Thank you for coming tonight, and I hope something of that has been helpful for you. If you'd like to watch more of those films, they're on that website that was on the screen. But thank you, and I hope that adds to the mix of the other speakers who are sharing with you this Lent. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Wasn't that a wonderful presentation? Thank you so much for that re-enchantment. Wonderful. Couple of minutes, just perhaps chat to your neighbour. How was that for you? What struck you? What of those images or words or ideas has lodged in your brain? Just a couple of minutes, and then we'll take some questions for Dave. Right, who would like to ask a question? We have a question here.
I've been well aware of climate change for well over 30 years, that scientists have been saying it. I'm not sure that leaders of the world haven't been listening. It's just, it costs money and there are not enough votes in it.
I think that's true. So I've been involved in trying to talk to churches about climate change for getting on for 25 years. And my observation would be, in terms of the political engagement, it waxes and wanes. And partially that is due to the economic cycle. So, when the economy is buoyant, it seems possible. And then when things happen with the banking crisis at the end of the noughties, it kind of goes off the boil and it's on the back burner. And then, we had a surge of optimism in the with the Paris Accord. And then, actually, I think the COP meeting that we hosted in 2021 actually built on that engagement. But sadly, as we've recovered and come out of COVID, and as the world economy is collapsing, and our economy is collapsing, governments start to back away from this and start to think it's unaffordable. You go for short-termism, and, and actually I had a young man knock on my door about 2 months ago who said, "Hello, I'm representing your local MP who happens to be a Conservative. Is there anything you would like to raise with him?" So I said, "Yes, climate change." And he went, "Climate change?" I said, "Yeah, climate change." He was there for 40 minutes. And talking about it, why it was important. And, and I was commending some of the things that the government had done. But, I said, "You're backing off now because you think it's an election winner." You know what I said to him? I said, "You're 20 points behind in the polls. You're not going to win." Do you know what he said? His face fell. He said, "I think you might be right." Sorry if you're supporting Conservative here. Anyway, so then I said to him, "Okay," I said, "Look, do something right. Don't do something for short-term gain, because it's probably not going to work. Do something right so it lays a foundation for the next phase." But we don't think like that. And that's a problem. We, as human species, we don't think 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead. We think very short-term, and it's a problem that's run not only on this issue, but on a lot of issues. Sorry, that's a long answer to an interesting question.
I'm going to put you in front of...
Oh, sorry, I apologise.
For the people at home.
Sorry,
No, you can come down here, but
sorry,
just so that you can be
people
seen.
At home. Sorry.
We have a question at the back there.
Dave, thank you very much for a really stimulating talk. So clearly you think the answer to the question about icons is yes, we can see the natural world as an icon or as a series of icons. I'm just wondering what, as you've done that praying with the icon of the natural world, what perspective on the life of God has changed for you through those icons?
I think it's kind of recognising some of the other character and activity of God in the wider world. I've also been very keen, actually, on encountering God outside these buildings. So when I was working at the Met Office, for me that was a place where I could encounter God in the daily flow of work. So I think it's just keeping an eye out for what I might see a glimpse of God in the world around me. But actually, I think it changes me more. God speaks to me through nature about me and who I am. It's a two-way thing. It's not just about me exploring something of God. It's about my relationship with God and Him shaping me. I do Celtic daily prayer. I've done it for 20 years now. And when I was in that sabbatical in lockdown in 2021, I used to sit on a camp chair looking out my patio doors at my garden. And I took a picture a week. And I did that through the entire of my 2.5 months on sabbatical. And I put together a sequence going from winter to spring and used it as part of the worship service. But Celtic daily prayer starts with the phrase, "One thing I've asked of the Lord, this is what I seek. That I will dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and seek Him in His temple." And I think actually in that 2 or 3 months I was doing that, looking at the garden, my understanding of that changed. I've found this over the years, over 20 years. You can use the same words every day, and yet your understanding of them changes through time. And I kind of suddenly got the sense that I was looking at the temple of God out in nature, in the garden. It wasn't about bricks and mortar building, it was actually about the world. That this is a place God inhabits and shares in and is active in. So that's what it's kind of done for me in my journey. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, partly, but only partly because I think the God question is really crucial, and Ilia Delio, who's a Franciscan and a scientist, says that if our theology and our cosmology are not engaged with each other and informed by each other, then God just becomes an idea.
Yeah.
And my sense is that because all of our understandings of the natural world, its origins, its extent, have changed so fundamentally that God has, in a sense, become more remote, and we haven't really changed in our essential knowledge of what God is like. And I think your invitation for us to see God through the icon of nature is a wonderful invitation. But I'm just wondering how we can allow that to really shape who God is for us. Because I think then that impacts how we respond.
Yeah, I think one of the things I explored in my master's thesis is how our scientific understanding might need to reshape some of our theology. So I think it's a very valid question. I think that's a journey that I'm still on and others are still on. So I personally feel actually science doesn't push God away. It actually draws God closer to us. And when I look at the science behind the world, and the main part of the films actually is an exploration of the science of the environment and how that connects loosely to some of our ideas of God's activity in the world. That to me draws God closer in. I guess... I talked about why I got interested in this visual encounter. My journey to faith began way, way back when I was doing my first degree in physics and astronomy. And after a year and a half of studying it and looking at amazing pictures that our space telescopes were producing, on a way to a lecture one morning, I suddenly had a thought that maybe there was a God. And then I had another thought, and it was, what's that got to do with me? And it took me a while to unpack that. So my visual encounter with God goes way, way back, I guess. You say it was the start of my faith journey. But thank you, that's a good question. Something to think about. Yeah.
My question follows on a little bit from that. You must have encountered many people as a scientist and a Christian who see science and Christianity as being incompatible. It's either or. And if you're a Darwinist, how can you believe the stuff that's in the scriptures and so on? And I'm interested in how you respond to those people, because as a Christian, I'm often faced with that sort of question from friends. How can you believe this stuff when there's so much science that doesn't seem compatible?
Yeah. So my journey... in faith. I grew up in a Baptist church, but in my teenage years I dumped church and faith because of science. But it was only when I got back to university and started studying science in more depth, actually that led me to that moment, that question, maybe there's a God behind this because of the order, the way it works together, the connections, the beauty of it together. Now, there are lots of scientists who are people of faith, Christians and other religions. And there are lots of scientists who aren't. And when we go into schools to talk to children about science and faith, I am honest about that. We are honest about that. All of us who speak in there are all Christians and have a science background in research or various ways with science. And we're honest about that. There are some scientists who are Christians and some scientists who this wondrous thing that they're exploring doesn't lead them to thinking about God and faith. In fact, they would say there isn't a God. I was doing an interview My life has got a bit interesting the last month since we released the films. I was doing an interview on Premier Christian Radio on their morning show. And so I was being interviewed, but people could email and text in questions. And I was not prepared for the questions that came in because they were so different to what I anticipated. But one of the questions was really interesting. One of the questions came in, it was this. It was, what would it take for David Attenborough and Chris Packham to believe in God after all that they've seen? Now, I don't know, I think they've done a fantastic job in raising awareness of the issues around the wonder of creation and the dangers that the environment is in because of human activity. I think it's still interesting. I do not know what would enable them to say, like me, maybe there is a God. The only thing I suggested that morning is they would need an encounter with God to tip them over the edge, because that's what happened to me. This kind of encounter with science and the possibility of God as a theoretical concept gradually evolved to a moment when actually God became quite real to me in a very personal way. And then I was in. And from that position, I can go back and start to explore science and the environment in a richer way, because I've got that lens of seeing it through God. How you get that lens is still a bit of a mystery to me at times. All I can say is something about God actually at work in our lives. But, we can say yes to that and we can say no to that. So.
Dave, I love your notion of playfulness and wonder. I believe the world is a sacramental place, and everything speaks in metaphor if we choose to look that way. And what struck me when I was listening to you, not only was my eyes opened, but also the vision of that sycamore tree being hacked down and the outcry as a result of finding it gone. There was a gap in that little valley, and people mourned and grieved for the loss. And that put me in mind that people have not lost completely that sense of otherness, of connectedness with the earth, and that the church or Christianity or faith needs to rekindle something of that latent desire in all humanity to long for something that is whole and complete. And your reference to Celtic spirituality touches me as well, having been to Ireland a few times. And thinking that element, before Christianity became a conquering, militaristic, colonizing force, had a connection with nature. And that's what we need to reclaim.
Thank you for that. I agree with a lot of what you said. I've started asking people, what's the first call to mission in the Bible? Sorry? To serve? Well, yeah, but when was it? What event was it? Sorry? Yeah, speaking to Adam. An invitation to care for creation. And yet we've forgotten that's at the heart of God's call to us as human beings. And I think, this is an age we need to resurrect that, along with all the other calls to mission that there are in the Bible. So I think that's what we need to reawaken in ourselves as church, but it's something we can try and share with our communities, our society too. And I think a lot of people out there who don't connect with faith and church actually have a real concern for creation. So where I was last a minister in a church in Croxley Green, we had a group called Green Croxley. It wasn't run by the churches, it was actually run by the green groups in the schools, run by a teacher. And we could get 300 people out on the streets of Croxley picking up litter after school on Earth Day. They weren't Christians, but they had a concern for their community and the environment of their community. So as Christians, we just joined in. We just became part of that group. We didn't run it. We were part of it, and we shared in it. And I think there's something in this, actually, that might start to connect us back to our wider communities out there, to build community, to work together, to draw them back, actually, to a sense of the sacred in this world that we feel.
Thank you. We're kind of running out of time a little bit, but maybe, Dave, you're going to be sort of wandering, or he's not rushing off, so perhaps some informal questions can be put to you as we're on our way out. But shall we give him another round of applause? It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Well, that was a real treat, and we've got one more of our conversations, which is going to be next Monday, the 11th of March, and that's at Cotton Parish Church, who will be hosting us, where Reverend Dr. Al Barrett, who's the author of a book that some of you may know, Being Interrupted, Reimagining the Church's Mission from Outside In, is going to speak on ensoiled spirituality, living out and earthed faith. And all of these conversations are going to be wrapped up in our spring environment fair. Maybe some ideas or something's been calling to you saying, what can I do in my community? What little thing? Well, come along to Alma Church on Saturday, March the 23rd, where we're going to be joined by all sorts of organisations, individuals, some of them Christian-based, some of them not, locally based, who will have stalls. We're going to have presentations, talks, performances and demonstrations, ways that we can really act out some of these things that we've been hearing in these conversations. So thank you very much for joining us again.